Questions from homeworks. Does anybody have questions from homeworks that they'd like to discuss? Or discus for the track and field people. It's a joke because discuss and discus are just one letter difference. One person thought it was funny. I'm thrilled.
I mean, I didn't know your class like itself, so like you could have changed it and not like the different types of self and the reaction they cause.
Okay, all right, well, I'll pick then. So let's do a graphing problem like number 13. So if I'm going to do one of these kinds of graphing problems, the first thing I need to do is figure out the values for the A, C, H, and K. Right, so I have that. And so what is my value for A then? -3. How about my value for C? -1/2, right? How about for K? Yeah, 0 for K, that's great. And now the H is tricky though, right? What are we going to have to remember to do for our H before we can look for it? Nope. Look here. Look there. What do you notice that's different? Daniel? Yeah, it's not factored. We want to factor the 2, not distribute, but like I knew what you meant. So if I factor that 2 off, what am I going to do to pi over 2? I have to divide it by 2, right? If I'm factoring that 2 off of it. What is pi over 2 divided by 2? Dividing fraction is kind of hard, right? How else could I think about it that might be a little easier? Multiplying by the reciprocal. So instead of dividing by 2, let's think about it as multiplying by 1/2. Pi over 2 times 1/2 is just going to be pi over 4. 1 times pi, 2 times 2. That's going to be pi over 4. So what is my H then going to be? Pi over 4. Everybody's okay there? Okay, so what's my amplitude going to be? It's the absolute value of A, so that's 3. What's my midline going to be? Close. Y equals 0. There you go. Very good. I even tried to help you out there if you look real close. Notice the A has an equal sign next to it, but the M has a colon. That's not a typo because the midline is an equation for a line. It needs like a Y equals or X equals or something, not just a number. Does that feel okay? Mr. Kulik, are you going to be that picky on a quiz or test? You betcha, but I'm warning you now about it, so that should help, right? That's got to be Y equals for the midline. The P is period. How do I find the period? 2 pi times the absolute value c. You're close. So what, in this case, what will the period be then? It would be just pi. 2 pi times a half is pi. And remember, what is frequency in relation to period? Just the reciprocal. Everybody's okay? So the first thing we did was we found those A, C, H, and Ks. We used those to figure out our amplitude, midline, period, and frequency. Now what we want to do is generate our points for our function. So I'm going to use my general formula, Cx plus H, Ay plus K. So RC was 1/2. Our H was pi over 4. Our A was -3, and our K was 0, so I'm not going to bother writing plus 0. Everybody's cool? So far, so good. I'm going to go to my reference points and grab the reference points for sine. You don't have to memorize those. Those would be given to you in the problem. So like if this were a test or quiz problem, I'd have like, like blanks that you'd have to fill in, right? Fill in your A, C, H, and K into that formula, and then fill in your new points after using that formula to transform the old ones. But everything else would be kind of given to you. So it'd be like a fill in the blank kind of setup. Does that make okay sense? So again, those key points, those reference points would be given to you. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my x and plug it in for x and see what my new x is. 1/2 times 0 plus pi over 4 is just pi over 4. And then I'll take 0 and plug it in for y. -3 times y is still 0. Or -3 times 0 is still 0. And then continue going, so I plug pi over 2 in. 1/2 times pi over 2 is pi over 4. Pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4, or just pi over 2. And then -3 times 1 is -3. And then I just kind of keep going. So I'm going to just kind of keep grinding through the arithmetic here. I'm just going to fill it in quickly because, well, as a math teacher, it's pretty easy for me to do that stuff in my head, but I'm just kind of continuing doing the same stuff I was just doing. Is everybody okay with how I got the points? Maybe not like the specific arithmetic I did, but like in general, the process that I'm using. Just plug in the x and y's into that formula and seeing what the new xy is, right? All right, so I'll go to my graph and start plotting. So if I look here, this is 0, and this is pi, so this has to be 1/2 a pi. And in between 0 and 1/2 must be 1/4 pi, right? Everybody agree with that? And if I look at my new x's, they're all going up by 1/4. So I have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4. So I know I'm going to have that. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in just some, that quarter mark in there that's not on my axis anywhere. And now I'm just going to start plotting. So I have pi over 4, comma 0. pi over 2, and then I have negative 3. And then I have 3 pi over 4, 0. And then I have pi positive 3. And then 5 pi over 3 back to 0. And I'm just going to kind of continue my pattern, right? So I'll go down to my minimum, back to my midline, up to my maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum, and fill in the same thing here. So we went minimum, midline, maximum, midline, minimum. Just kind of connect my dots then. Does that feel okay there? Yeah, Tommy?
I'm a little confused on how you got the period.
Okay. So the formula was 2 pi times the absolute value of C. So I plugged 1/2 in, which was my value for C. So the absolute value of 1/2 is 1/2. 2 pi times 1/2 is just going to be 2 pi over 2, which reduces down to pi.
Okay. How'd you get C again?
So the C is the reciprocal for the coefficient on my x, because I know that in the formula it's 1 over C, so it's always just going to be the reciprocal for that coefficient.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah.
So the C is always the reciprocal and the H is always the opposite, right? You might have to factor to get that H isolated, but again, it's minus pi over 4, but the H will be positive pi over 4. If it was plus pi over 4, the H would be negative pi over 4. So far, so good? It's okay? Let's do a writing an equation one. So let's say we do this guy, and I ask you to write it as a sine function. So the first thing, or what we're gonna, actually I should say, what we wanna do is we need to find that formula, right? Yes, Sam? I mean, what might be a good idea? We've used it a whole heap, right? Like every time we do any of these problems, it's like, got to figure out my A, C, H, and K. How am I going to do it? Looking at the formula, I'm going to have to write the formula. How am I going to do that? Got to find my A, C, H, and K and then plug it in. Well, for the test, you could put it on a note card, which you'd be crazy not to put that on your note card, right? But we've used it like, I don't know, I've probably written it 25 times so far this chapter. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the midline, the period, the amplitude to figure out some of these values. So if I look at this graph, looks like the midline is, again, the part that divides it in half. Right, that looks like the midline. You guys agree with that? That is at -1. So what coefficient does that give me? A, C, H, or K? K is correct. What is the K then? Well, just -1, right? The midline is y equals -1. but the k is just a number. That's -1. So that's 1 down. If we want the amplitude next, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to an extrema. So say that distance there. So how far is it from -1 up to +1? Okay. So what does that tell me that, or which coefficient does that tell me about, A, C, H, or K? A. So the absolute value of A is just the amplitude. So A is going to be ±2. We'll talk about how we know whether it should be positive or negative in a second. Sound good? Okay. The period is the length of one full cycle. So let's say we start counting at that maximum. We do a down, and we end back where we started at the maximum, right? That's one cycle. So we started at 0 and we ended at pi. So how far was that? Pi. So the formula for period, 2 pi times the absolute value of c is equal to our period. To solve for c, then I need to divide by 2 pi. What is pi divided by 2 pi equal? 1/2. And we always pick c to be positive. So far, so good there. Now, if we're going to write this as a sine function, I need a midpoint. Does anybody see a midpoint on this graph? Yes. What is that midpoint? Can you read it? I know it's blurry. Pi over 4 comma -1, right? So I'm going to use that to get which coefficient, A, C, H, or K? Hopefully we say H because we've accounted for the other 3 already, right, Mr. Hulick? So the H is just going to be the x coordinate. But now that I've picked the point I'm using and the function I'm using, I've picked sine for my function, and the point that I'm using, I can figure out the sine for A. That's the last thing. So what I need to do, if I'm using that midpoint, I look at the extrema to the right of it. That extrema is a minimum. That tells me the A is negative. And now we can just fill these into our formula. So 1 over c is the reciprocal of c, so I'm just going to write the reciprocal there. So there's an answer. If I wanted to do cosine instead, this stays the same. This would stay the same. This plus or minus 2 is going to stay the same. The only difference is the point that I'm going to use, which means I'll get a different h, and then possibly the sine of a could be different also. Yes, Gabby?
Does that say a minus b equals 2 on the top or equal to? Like right at the top, where next to the period.
AMP
Yeah, but underneath that.
says AMP equals 2.
Well, that's it. Wait. Okay,
That's okay. If you can't read my writing, you can ask about it. I know sometimes it's less than spectacular. We're zoomed in really far, so the writing gets kind of bad. Yes. Great question. Which points do I need to use if I'm going to use a cosine? I need to use a max or a min, an extrema. So if I did the maximum, that was 0, 1. or I could have done the minimum, which was pi over 2 negative 3. Right, those were the ones that were labeled in my picture. Oh my goodness, come on now. Right, 0, 1, or pi over 2 negative 3. So if I had used 0, 1, what is the h? 0. If I'd used pi over 2, what is the h? Pi over 2. If I'd used 0, 1, the sign for a should be positive because it's a maximum. If I used pi over 2, the sign for a should be negative because it's a minimum. Gabby, what's up?
For sign, is it not asking for the maximum minimum? Is it just asking for the midpoint?
So I only use the midpoint to get sign.
Okay.
If you tried to use a max or a min, it's a nightmare.
Okay.
So we're just, if that's what you got, you write a cosine function. If you have a midpoint, you write a sine function. You don't try to write, try to cram like a square peg into a round hole. You can do it, but it's way harder than it needs to be, and we're not even gonna, I would never ask you to do something like that. So I'm not gonna even show you the nightmare that it is in an effort to not confuse anybody on something that's already complicated enough for most of us, right? So my answers then, if I wanted to write a cosine equation, I could do y equals 2 cosine 2x minus 0 minus 1, or I could have written y equals negative 2 cosine 2 times x minus pi over 2 minus 1. Any one of those three would have been an acceptable correct answer, unless I ask specifically for give me this as a cosine or give me this as a sine, unless the directions tell you I need it in this way. But if the directions just say write the sinusoid for this, any one of those three would have been acceptable. They all are correct. They all give you the exact same picture if we graphed them. If the directions say, write the sinusoid for this using a sine function, then you had to write the sine version. Gabby.
Will there always be two answers for the cosine version?
Well, there's only two answers because I had both a max and a min given to me in the problem. If I had just one of them, then I'd have only one version, So that was just a nature. If I've given two midpoints and an extrema, then I could write two sine versions, right? So it just kind of depends on what you're given. Does that feel okay? Better? Refreshing some stuff? Okay. All right. Today, we're going to finish up section 3.2. Sure. So in section 3.2, we're talking about graphing. We've been talking about tangents in section 2. Last time we talked about writing the equation from tangent from a graph. Today we're going to talk about writing the graph from the equation. So again, the first thing I'm going to start is identifying the values for A, C, H, and K. So to do that, I'm going to use this formula. What's my value for A gotta be? -2. How about my value for C? Regular 2. Right, so -2 is my A. Remember that x over 2 is the same as 1/2 x. So like C is just 2 then, right? You guys see that? What's my H gotta be? 0. Do you see anything being added or subtracted from the X? Nope. That's why it's a 0. And the K is -1. Wonderful. So if I ask for the amplitude, the midline, the period, and the frequency, let's start with the easiest one. What's the amplitude going to be here? No. It's a tangent graph, not a sine or cosine graph. There isn't any. There's no amplitude, not applicable, doesn't exist because there is no extrema, right? Oh yeah. Trick question to start. It was an easy one, but you tricked me, Mr. Kulik. It's my goal every day. I want to get all my good tricks out now, so when the test comes around, you won't be tricked on the test, right? Let's get them all out of the way now. So you can't be like, we didn't talk about that, and be like, oh, actually we did. And I just tricked you twice. That's a shame on you, right? We're not going to get tricked again if you're a George W. Bush fan, right? There's a saying like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And he was giving a speech, and he screwed it up. He's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, not going to get fooled again. It was big news for a while. It was funny. It's in a song?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Midline. What's the midline? Make sure you format it properly. What's the midline going to be? Y equals, I heard somebody say, -1. Yeah, I got to have that y equals there, though. Period. It's tangent, though, so the formula's a little different. Oh, yes, okay. So you gave me the final answer. Yeah, the period is pi times c for tangents. Oh, Mr. Kulik. So Max is correct. The period is 2 pi.
Every now and again.
Yeah, no, I thought you were doing something different. No, you're right. I fully admit it. And the frequency is always just the reciprocal for the period. So 1 over the period, easy peasy. But again, because it's tangent, the period formula is pi times c. Ugh! Of course. Okay. So now we go and we write our function map the same way we did for sines and cosines. So if I fill in my c, x, I'm not going to bother writing +0 for my h. Is everybody okay with how I filled that in? So I just filled in my values for c, h, a, and k into that equation. And then I'm going to take my reference points for tangent. That is those guys. Ugh, Mr. Kulik, what the heck is und mean? What the? Is that short for underwear? Ha ha ha. Yes, student, it's short for underwear. No. What do you guys think und is short for?
Undefined.
Undefined. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. What do you think? How do I draw undefined, Mr. Kulik? When I'm drawing my graph, what's going to go where there's an undefined thing? Not 0. Not 1. Think about what the graph of tangent looked like yesterday. Yeah, Anthony's right. It's the vertical asymptotes. That's what the undefined is telling you, is that that's where a vertical asymptote is. So far, so good? So if I take my x and plug it in, 2 times negative pi over 2 is just negative pi. And it doesn't matter what you do to undefined, it stays undefined. So 2 times undefined plus 7 is still just undefined. Undefined is undefined. Whatever you do to it, it just stays that way. And then I continue plugging in. 2 times negative pi over 4 is negative pi over 2. And then that'll give me a negative 1. So that's a 1 there. And then we got a 0 comma negative 1. We got a positive pi over 2 and then a negative 3. And then a positive pi und. Yes, sir. You may. Will you pull the door shut in your way? Thanks. Maybe the loudest has already happened, but I don't want to risk it. All right, now let's say we want to graph this from, say, negative 2 pi to positive 2 pi. What would I want my tick marks to be? How far apart should my ticks on my x be? Well, how far apart are the x coordinates in my points? Daniel? Pi over 2. So let's make every tick mark pi over 2 long. Sound good to you guys? So that's half a pi, 1 pi, 1 1/2, 2. Half pi, 1 pi, 1 1/2, 2. And my x's, well, it looks like, or I'm sorry, my y's, looks like everything is just going up by 1, right? Because I go from negative 3 to positive 1. What do you guys think? So looks okay? I'm going to put my asymptotes in first. So there's negative pi undefined. And here's positive pi undefined. And then if I draw in, I have negative pi over 2 negative, or positive 1, 0 negative 1, and then positive pi over 2 negative 3. Just kind of draw my part. Do a better looking graph than that, Mr. Kulik. You know, that's a little better. Is everybody okay with what I've drawn there? As a word of warning to you guys, you need to have some curve in your graph. If you just draw something like that, I'm going to mark you down on it because it looks to me like those arrows should be crossing the asymptote, right? Your graph has to get vertical next to the asymptote before you put your arrow on there. So you guys see the difference? But I have to fill the space, right? So I'm going to have from my asymptote, that'll be like the start of my new cycle. I had 1, 2, 3 tick marks and then an asymptote. So 1, 2, I'm going to add another tick mark and then add another one for my asymptote. And do the same thing back here. So I have start, 1, 2, 3 tick marks and then an asymptote. And then I'm just going to kind of fill in from there. Look, I had like a stroke while I was trying to draw that one, apparently. So that would be my graph filling the space, right? Now, somebody might ask, Mr. Kulik, you added like some extra tick marks to the end of that. What if I just did, what if I just had something like this? Would that have been okay? Yeah, sure. You don't have to have the full cycle. Now, I think you're crazy not to draw the full cycle. because it's hard to draw just like half of a cycle sometimes. Like it's kind of confusing where to stop and end. I'd always just prefer to kind of give more than I needed. But you don't have to if you are good at eyeballing that kind of stuff. You could certainly do that, and that would be okay. What do you think? Basically the same thing as graphing the sine and cosine stuff, right? The picture at the end is different, but like the process of how I'm generating my points and everything is like almost exactly the same. Shouldn't be too bad. You guys hear that noise? You know what that is? It's the fan on the projector. And I'm about ready to take a sledgehammer to the thing. But I think I might get fired, so I'm going to have to just like find my inner zen. But it's driving me nuts. Imagine being in the same room all day listening to that stupid thing. All right. The next one, or our next example, this will be our final example here today. Yay! Says find the location of the vertical asymptotes for y equals negative tan of 2x minus pi over 2. To do this, all I really need is I need the h and I need the c. The c I know is just related to that coefficient on the x. They're reciprocals. Everybody's good there. And I know the h is related to that thing that's being added or subtracted from the x, but what do I have to do to that first? I have to factor those innards, right? So if I factor that 2 off, that's really pi over 4 there. Everybody's cool with that? I mean, if it was just like constant one noise, but it's like starting and stopping and like a different pattern, it's just like, all right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to find the location of one asymptote so I'm going to take from my reference points list, I'm going to take one of the asymptotes for tangent. I chose negative, try it again, Kulik, negative pi over 2. And I'm going to transform that. Now, to transform it, all I need is the cx plus h part, because nothing happens to undefined, right? So my c was 1/2, and my h was pi over 4. So that's going to turn into 1/2 times negative pi over 2 is negative pi over 4. If I add pi over 4 to that, that's going to be 0. Everybody okay with that? So that's just the location of one vertical asymptote. Where's the next vertical asymptote after that? Or how far is the next vertical asymptote from that one going to happen? Remember, if we look at our reference points, the start of our period is an asymptote, and the end of our period is an asymptote. So what does that mean? It means that in between each asymptote is one period. So my next vertical asymptote is going to be 0 plus a period, and our period was going to be pi times the absolute value of c. So that's pi over 2. So our next period is pi over 2, undefined, right? What would the period after that, or the, what would be the vertical asymptote after that? It's going to add another half pi, right? So 1 pi undefined. The one after that, 1.5 pi undefined. I can keep doing that forever if I wanted to. Or I can write kind of the general formula for all my vertical asymptotes is going to be that first vertical asymptote plus the period times this constant, where that constant can only be an integer. So that set of symbols here at the end is just saying my vertical asymptote's at 0, and then every period, whole number amount of periods after 0. So 5 periods down the line, another vertical asymptote. Minus 6 periods forward, another vertical asymptote. Always going to have these vertical asymptotes all over the place.
That's how it looks always.
Yep. Yeah, so this just says is a member of the set, and that's integers. But I can generate asymptotes by just plugging in integers for b and then, doing the arithmetic, right? If b is 7, 0 plus pi over 2 times 7 is going to be another asymptote. I can just pick integers for b and just generate, and then whatever asymptotes I need, however many, wherever I need them. You know what I mean? Okay. Any questions on what we've done here so far? Okay, clear your desks, other pencils and calculators. Homework quiz time.